Well, welcome, Kevin, to the Composer Chronicles. How are you doing today?
Having a great one. Thank you. Calling in from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Nice. Shout out to Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Go Blue.
Well, you are a bit of a different guest than we normally have. Normally, we have composers from all around the world. And today, we have a conductor on the podcast. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey to becoming the conductor you are, and let's go from there.
Awesome. Sure. Well, I'm actually visiting my family, so I'm home in Ann Arbor area, Michigan. Not Ann Arbor proper, but just right outside. I grew up here, and I had no music background until I was 11 when I started in school band, and I didn't want to do gym, so that's why I did band. So I had no prior interest really. And I mean, it's so cliche, but I immediately fell in love with it and started practicing religiously and getting super into music and learning everything I could about it. And was ended up going to Interlochen Arts Academy to study there. And I'm a trumpet player, by the way, just like you. Uh,
Yes.
so I studied Interlochen, and that's where I started kind of getting the conducting bug. And actually, my first performances were there.
Hmm.
And then I went on to the Easton School of Music, where I studied trumpet, but and music theory. Uh,
Hmm.
thank God for that, actually. But and I get a lot of conducting there. I would say it was an unofficial minor in conducting.
Hmm.
Um, and then I went to University of Michigan for my master's degree and studied orchestral conducting there. So I was back at home, kind of, hence the Go Blue. And I kind of had a long, right after I finished my master's, I started Apex Contemporary Performance, which is my own organization, which we played the music of underrepresented and underperformed composers
Okay.
in Michigan. So that covers, people from the BIPOC community, people that, need more opportunities and who need a platform for their music, but also composers like who we're going to speak about today, Pierre Boulez, who
Hmm.
although they are super well known and famous or infamous, depending how you look at it, their music doesn't get played a whole lot, mainly because of the complexity. So and the
Right.
difficulty involved. So we've done, Hans Abrahamson, Unsuk Chin, Ashley Fuhr. I mean, just to name a few composers that we like to mix them all together. Those two
Mhm.
groups.
Wonderful.
Um, yeah, and then a lot of stuff happened, and I got an assistant conductor job at the Alabama Symphony Orchestra in Birmingham, Alabama, and I've had that position since 2018. And I continue to guest conduct, and my focus is contemporary music and working with living composers or recent, mm, I don't want to say recently deceased. That's a little morbid, but composers that reflect more of the vibe of the last 50 years.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes total
So
sense.
yeah, and just doing my thing.
Wonderful. Well, that's fantastic. And yes, you did mention that today's episode is about Pierre Boulez. You have mentioned several times that Pierre Boulez is one of your heroes and somebody you really look up to. Why is that?
How much time you got? Um, where do I start with Boulez? Well, my first thing I will say about him, the reason I look up to him is that he is such an outstanding musician in the most concrete sense. His ear is unparalleled.
Mhm.
It's a very storied and uh, often controversial topic because he's, said a lot of things to musicians that no one else can say and done a lot of things that no one else can do.
Really?
Um,
What's like what?
Oh, well, he's known for his when he did the Peleus and Melisande at the Covent Garden with
Hmm.
the BBC. One of his first main conducting posts, um, they started the tuning process, and he immediately told them to stop, and he tuned each player.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's something
That
that you could never do today with the climate of orchestras. But he has an amazing memory for pitch, an amazing ear for pitch, and has an amazing training, the French training. And even by those standards, he was freakishly good. So
mm,
you can watch him rehearsing the Vienna Phil, and he's with bare three pieces or his own notation for orchestra, and he's correcting the notes and these super crazy textures, and you
mm,
know he's just known for that. Also, another thing I love about him is how he is always challenging the status quo.
Hmm.
He was very much an iconoclast and a very controversial and outspoken figure about this standard orchestral and operatic system that exists and how limiting it is for the progression of the musical art form.
Okay.
I mean, he started writing about that in the 50s,
Mm.
but he kind of kept beating that drum all the way through. I mean, he didn't beat that drum so loudly when he started getting really huge fees for his conducting, but earlier on, he felt a lot of frustration, I think, about the limits that, especially the American Symphony Orchestra system places on, rehearsal lengths and numbers of rehearsals per cycle, or how many services you can have in a week. These things that he thought were limiting.
Right.
So, he was always, pushing that agenda. And then I just love how he was not only an advocate for his own music and continued to compose throughout his entire international career as a conductor, but he, really promoted new music and brought some of the most avant-garde compositions to very conservative places and very conservative audiences.
Yeah.
And I think that he made a lot of repertoire much more mainstream and much, or maybe not mainstream, but at least kind of to be expected,
Hmm.
I think specifically the works of Olivier Messiaen, like his later works, especially, orchestras were not playing that stuff, and now I think
Yeah.
you're going to see those pieces, especially like at Expecto and the City on High and Chronochromine. Sorry, I mispronounced it. Chronochromie. Uh, these pieces that no one really played in a symphony orchestra setting. He recorded them with Cleveland and several other groups and programmed them a lot. So, I mean, I could go on and on. I mean, he was just he wasn't just a doer, he was a real thinker and a real force for change
Right.
in terms of kind of breaking out of the conservative programming norms of American concert life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very interesting. When we first started talking, and I wanted to bring you on, and you had mentioned the idea of uh, con- uh, conductors who are composers as well, and it's so interesting to think about because Pierre Boulez was somebody who, in my personal mind, was more of a conductor than he was a composer.
Mm.
At least when I was originally introduced. And of course, as I grew to be a more well rounded musician and historian, I, of course, grew to know that. But uh, what do you think? Do you find that people gravitate towards one side or the other of his career more than the other?
Well, he's definitely much more known for being a conductor only because of the fact that he conducted his conducting career brought him to the like highest echelons of the music world.
Mm,
He's conducting the biggest American orchestras. I mean, he's one of the few people who's been music director of the New York Philharmonic, for example.
right.
He's conducted all the major American orchestras, all the major European orchestras. So just in terms of like where does his face show up and in what
Yeah.
context, on album covers, on concert posters.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I think if you talk to more composers who are like especially for who have European backgrounds or who are in more of the post-tonal style,
Right.
they might think of him only as a composer,
Mm,
or they might, um, so his repertoire that I just mentioned how he programmed a lot of, you know, more on the avant-garde side, but he also conducted a lot of more traditional repertoire. Like we talked about, he's known for his Mahler recordings and his
right.
Bruckner recordings as well. So I think he was able to kind of diversify his brand. If you're talking in 2021 terms, he wasn't just a new music guy. He wasn't just a French guy.
Yeah.
He had a lot to offer. And yeah, his music is very much not part of the vernacular of the repertoire because of its extreme virtuosity.
Yeah.
And often one of his biggest criticisms of the symphony orchestra that he talks about in his book or Orientations is how rigid the instrumental forces must be in an orchestra. He
Hmm.
very rarely wrote for a full symphony orchestra. It was usually some kind of ensemble. Like if you look at Ensemble into Contemporain, 31 musicians, most of
Hmm.
his compositions could be played by EIC. So, like, this idea of, well, an orchestra is 10 firsts and 10 seconds and 8 violas. Like he just didn't think that that was necessary.
Mhm.
And so I think a lot of, he does have some pieces for orchestra, mainly his Notation, which were orchestra pieces, piano pieces that he redid for orchestra. But even at that point, he was thinking of the modern American Symphony Orchestra, Chicago Symphony commissioned that. So, even though he was writing in, 9 and 10 divisi for the
Mhm.
strings, um, he was still kind of thinking of that each person's a soloist kind of texture.
Right, right.
Um, so I don't want to say people don't know because they're ignorant. I just think that it would be harder to kind of stumble upon Boulez's music at an orchestra concert, or he didn't write any operas. So,
Mhm.
if you think about where do people find out about new composers,
Right.
he's not
Mhm.
showing up in those places unless there's some specific event especially in the years following his death. There were a lot of Boulez retrospective concerts, and a lot of orchestras were putting on shows.
Yeah.
Um, but the music is intimidating,
Yeah.
and it's not something that I think maybe all audience members would understand at the first go.
Yeah.
Um, but anyway, we can talk about that later.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about because I mean, like you said, he doesn't really write anything for a large orchestra, uh, and some of the things that I have heard are don't necessarily fit within like a chamber kind of ensemble. I mean, you can
Exactly.
so it kind of sits there in the middle of who can play this, and unless we just cut down our orchestra a lot or we add more musicians to our chamber group, where are we going to be able to play this music? And I think it takes a lot of innovation and thinking and ensembles that are already outside of the box to play Boulez's music. And unfortunately, I think because they those kind of ensembles are not within the mainstream, Boulez's music also falls within that problem as well. Um, so yeah, I wish more people listen to Boulez's music, but unfortunately, that's the problem that we face with it.
Hmm. Yeah, it's. I think it's becoming more and more. I'll just say this: more and more conductors that I would say are not new music specialists
Hmm.
are programming Boulez or are even exploring his music.
That's good.
Um, One of the things that I think makes Boulez more accessible, and actually in some ways, is that because his knowledge of the canon, the repertoire that came before him, is so sophisticated because of his level of interaction with it. That's the
Yeah.
thing that really I think makes him so different than other composers, is that he was performing the music of the people that came before him in
Right.
such an intense way. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
I think that his scores, even though they're complex and have a lot going on, there's a way that they read kind of within the notational, especially his later works, the notational norms. They read
Hmm.
much more within the notational norms than, say, John Cage or composers who said, I'm going to get different sounds by writing in a different notation.
Hmm.
He was doing innovation through notational norms. Now, there are some specific things we can get into about what makes his notation different or how he writes.
Hmm.
And it's very hard to generalize because his writing style changed so much over the course of his oeuvre. But I would say that, especially something like the notations for orchestra, any conductor with their salt can pick that up and probably figure it out. Doesn't mean you're going to have the greatest possible result. But you don't have to be necessarily a quote unquote new music specialist. I think that there's something universal about how he writes,
Right.
that allows anyone with a good training in music and the patience to go through it, the tools to decode it and make sense of it.
Yeah. For those who have never really listened to Boulez's music, we're talking a lot about it, but how would you kind of describe it? It's a hard
Hmm.
question,
It's a
but
hard question. Well, I'll give you this. So Boulez, on many occasions, referred to his music as a synthesis of Webern and Debussy.
okay.
That was his answer.
Hmm.
So Webern the youngest student of Schoenberg, he really took serialism to the most abstract place.
Yeah.
It was still extremely ordered, but it was more based on range and timbre, and he was using serialism in every aspect of the music, which
Hmm.
is something that Boulez definitely did, and especially in the earlier stages with the structures, 1 and 2. So I would say that there is this colorfulness and whimsy and freedom
Hmm.
in his music that you might associate with Debussy and Ravel.
Yeah.
And then there's, of course, this very rigid structure and, 12 tone music
Right.
um, that you would hear in Webern. When I was in Switzerland at the Lucerne Festival Academy and we were doing a class with Boulez, unfortunately, was not able to be there, but he originally was, but he was too ill.
Mm.
Matthias Pincher, the next best thing, was who runs Ensemble into Contemporary, and now his protege um, was the teacher. But we got to go to the Paul Soccer Foundation in Basel
Okay.
and go underground into this James Bond like vault and see Boulez's sketches.
Oh,
And when
wow.
you look at the pages and pages of sketches of matrices and different, he was very interested in like pitch multiplication, which even is kind of beyond my theory knowledge. But you take a set or a row, and then you get the other resulting pitches based on like a each pitch gets goes through an interval multiplication. So you'll do like a minor second, and then I don't really know how it works. To be honest with you, I'd have to go back and read. But the theorists that were working with us knew how it worked, and I mean, it's just so much thought goes behind the getting the raw material.
Yeah.
But the beautiful thing about Boulez, in my view, is that he's always thinking about the aesthetic at the end of the day. So
Yeah.
he's using that raw material, but he's not just like giving you a math problem on a piece.
Hmm.
He's thinking about the feel and the pacing and the affect. You look at Boulez's scores, especially like the later pieces, like Derive 2 and Sur Six. There's so many descriptive adjectives all over the place about how the music should be played. Um, he's very detailed.
Hmm.
One of my favorites, and I cannot remember the French word, but it translates. It's so fun to say. I wish I could remember it. It's to tear, to rip away, and
Okay.
that's what he says for the last chord in Derive 2. So the music is very evocative. I know that that is a word that gets kind of thrown around a lot, but when I'm listening to him, I always kind of know the vibe that he's going for.
Yeah.
You can always put words to it. It is abstract, but it's not so abstract. I feel like he talks about pure expression a lot in some of his interviews, and I think that the compositional process of saying, okay, I want my music to be mysterious. you
Hmm.
know if you give him a word, I feel like he could, even within his rigid system, create a mysterious sounding thing. Does
Yeah.
that make sense? Like
Oh,
I think it goes
absolutely.
back to his roots with Mallarmé and the poetry,
Yeah.
and Debussy and Mallarmé and that through line, and this idea of impressions, making an impression of something.
Yeah.
Using words and certain types of implications. It's not angry, obvious. It's like the impression of that,
Yeah.
or whatever the idea may be. So it's extremely evocative, and his music goes from the whole emotional spectrum to, or I should say, expressive, because it might not be all about emotions the way romantic composers were. He hated that.
Right. Oh, yeah.
But expression of low energy or peacefulness, all the way to complete frenzy and out of
Yeah.
in a ballistic kind of way.
Mhm.
So yeah, I don't think Boulez is enjoyable if you're listening to it in a passive way.
Yeah.
I think you have to really submerge yourself. And beyond that, I think that one thing that connects him to his conducting is that his music has a physicality to it.
Mhm.
Like when you watch people play Boulez's music, it makes more sense
Yeah, I
than
was
when
just
you just
thinking
hear
that.
it. Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think that's another thing that comes into his conducting, because he's a huge fan of virtuosity, and he talks about how he likes the conductor to have virtuosity too. And there's a lots of things that are hard for the conductor in his music. And there's a certain idea of kind of kinetic energy in his music, where like things are still and then they're moving,
Mhm.
and this kind of play of motions. I
Yeah.
think that that's definitely something that influences him. And if you want to get into Boulez, start with watching. Start with watching because I think that it's much more entertaining and kind of it just makes sense.
Yeah, I totally agree with that because the first time I found out that Boulez was a composer, I just went on his to find a recording, and I only listened to it, and I don't remember exactly how old I was. I was probably still in my undergrad, and I was like, oh, I don't want to listen to this. This is this is boring.
Yeah,
And I think the first time I actually saw it in concert, I remember an ensemble that I went to go see while I was when I first moved here to Philadelphia was performing a burlesque piece, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so much more enjoyable. You have to experience this composer's music. You have to be present. You have to see it. It's it's an experience that you have to be present for. You can't just put it on a recording. You can't just pull it up on your phone like I did on my walk yesterday.
yeah,
And I did that because I was preparing myself for this talk today. But if you truly want to enjoy Boulez, you can't just put it on and then just walk away from it.
yeah. I
So
would say
I
at first. I mean, maybe you can kind of drift in and out of it when you get more familiar with it. But I
right.
remember one time I was on a flight and I put on an album and I fell asleep, but I kind of had this like weird, like latent sleep where I was like kind of in and out of consciousness listening to it, and that was kind of fun. But yeah, definitely at first get used to it by just kind of and go with the shorter pieces. He has a lot of short pieces.
Mhm.
Start with the piano music, especially. I think a lot of that is really fun to experience. And yeah, go from there.
Absolutely. I will get a chance to talk to you about some of those pieces a little bit later. But before I actually get there, I want to ask you uh, what you think Boulez's career has had. I'm going to start with his conducting career. What do you think Boulez's conducting career has had on uh, today's conductors and and that field of music?
Oh, well, I think he was a complete game changer in many ways.
Hmm.
He was the antithesis of, or he was a complete foil to someone like Leonard Bernstein, who was
Hmm.
all about, frankly, melodramatic and over the top emotional expression. Anything nostalgic, Boulez was not about.
Mm.
Um, and maybe some of his writings were a little more pointed than his actual feelings, but that's another conversation. But I think he separated this idea that you have to be a verklempt, Sturm emotionally unstable person. This kind of that like maestro kind of idea. He completely went against that. He didn't use a baton. His
Mm.
gestures are very economical. He created a new language for conducting that I use, many others
Mm.
use. Whether we're copying him or not, there is kind of a more or less technique that is used more for contemporary music that I think he totally fathered. Um, and then I think this idea that a conductor can just go their whole career and not conduct Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn.
Yeah.
I think the earliest thing he wanted to program with the New York Phil was Schumann,
Yeah.
and he refused to conduct Brahms. So, you know, this idea that you can say no and like you don't
Yeah.
have to, you can create your own repertoire and you don't have to be a jack of all trades. You can
Yeah.
specialize. And I think he was just a real class act.
Hmm.
And I mean, he was very private about his personal life, and there's not much that people know, but he
Hmm.
was always punctual, polite, unless he was reading your music. And by
Yeah.
reading, I mean like drag race style reading.
Right.
um, and I never met the guy, but everything I've read about him, I've read pretty much every book there is about him. And
Hmm.
he was just very intellectual and polite
Hmm.
and focused on the work, disciplined. They say he slept on a little cot that wasn't comfortable at all, and he barely slept, and he basically studied all the time. So whether
Wow.
that's actually true or that's just a kind of a picture of this monastic life that he apparently led, I'm not sure, but I
Yeah.
like to believe it. They say don't meet your heroes.
Yeah.
And maybe I needed to keep this idea of him kind of being that way. But he never had any public scandal. Like he never had any he was never married. There was speculation about his private life, but he never had like a public relationship. He
Yeah.
was just kind of, his perception was that he was all about the work. So I think
Yeah.
that was kind of an interesting thing. He also just set this unprecedented standard for like what a conductor's ear should be like,
Hmm.
because after him, we all have something to live up to or measure ourselves against.
Of course. Yeah.
So I think there's that for sure.
Wonderful. And despite his dim light on the overarching uh, main body of repertoire in today's music, he certainly has had an influence on the compositional side of things. What do you think has been that what's the word I'm looking for, that impact?
Hmm. Well, that's a good question. It might be hard for me to answer because I'm not a composer, and I do know very many composers closely, but a lot of them are in awe of Boulez's music, but I don't think very many of them actually understand it or have taken the time to like really study his music. And
Right.
let's see, the biggest impact, or one of the biggest impacts, I would say, is that he continued to write 12-tone music, serial music,
Hmm.
of various levels of rigidity in the system his entire career.
Yeah.
And most composers go through phases, or maybe they go through more, they leave that structure and go to a postmodern situation like George Rockberg or something like that. I mean, there are many examples of that where the composer goes atonal and then back to tonal or something. He stayed true to his beliefs. Um, I am sure that if I knew more of the composers that kind of were alive during Boulez's time and maybe were influenced by him,
Hmm.
he was giving lectures at the Donau Eschingen Festival a lot and teaching. He was teaching a lot, and he went to where's the Darmstadt, and taught composers there. So I would just say the fact that we still have composers writing 12-tone music
Hmm.
today probably has a lot to do with him.
Yeah.
I mean, that's still the main mode of teaching in Europe.
Oh,
Uh,
really? Okay.
in the in the in the the continent, not UK. The UK has gone
Yeah.
with the US in terms of postmodernism, but
Mm.
um, I would say that for the most part, like if you're studying at the Paris Conservatoire, you're still studying these. You're probably poring over Boulez scores as a model.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's that's very interesting to think about. Um, but I think that is going to be all we have for this public YouTube version of this episode. So if you want to finish listening to us talk about Pierre Boulez, you can finish listening on the podcast. You can find that on any podcast platform. And you can also finish watching this video by becoming a member on my Patreon page for $5 a month or $10 a month. You can find all the links to that in the description below. So we hope to see you there. Thank you very much, Kevin, for being the guest today. And we both hope to see you all on the Patreon or in the podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the Alexandrian Media YouTube channel for more videos like this one, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. You can find all information about this episode below in the description, and give this video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed watching. I look forward to seeing you over at the podcast or on the Patreon to finish up this episode.
Alexandrian Media, art and culture for the modern era.